ought to be in pictures. You're wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures.
Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This week we are talking Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans.
Hey, but you can do us a big favor. If you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, just go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And while you're there, ding the little bell. And that way you're notified every single time a new video drops. And just a reminder, Deep Dive Movie Reviews does contain spoilers, so you have been warned. James, I'm really looking forward to talking about Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, every time Steven Spielberg has a new film out, it is sort of cause for conversation, I think. And this is one that has clearly been gestating within him his entire life. This is essentially a biopic, an autobiography. It is loosely based, he says, on his own family, his own upbringing in New Jersey, Arizona, and then California. It's about his parents as much as it is about himself. Played here by Michelle Williams and Paul Dano as Mitzi and Bert Fabelman, essentially his parents. The surrogate character for himself is Sammy Fabelman, and we watch him as he evolves, as he grows from a young boy into a teenager graduating high school and looking for his first job, and most importantly, falling in love with cinema. So where to begin, Steve?
James, my first thought when I saw the trailer for The Fabelmans is, one, how much I was looking forward to this. I mean, it's Steven Spielberg, and we don't have to belabor the point because it's been said by everybody in the universe how this is such a personal project to him. I mean, obviously we watched it last night, and how many times do we have the director, creator of film address the audience before a film saying, thank you for coming to this movie because it's such a personal project for me. I mean, this is a love letter, not only to his family, but to cinema itself. And I think that initial thought I had when I saw the trailer was the cinema paradiso. That love for film from such a young age. We see with young Sammy Fabelman, who is obviously the stand-in for Spielberg, that from a young age, the magic that Spielberg creates in so many of the movies we've come to love over the years are burst in this understanding at such a young age of the magic of film itself. And for that reason, I mean, this movie is not without its flaws, and we'll get into those in a moment. But I think I want to say from the onset, I really enjoyed this film.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that we saw him address the audience at the beginning. I mean, it's not part of the movie, but it was, tacked on by the distributors. Because on the one hand, yes, he does want to sort of introduce the film as being such a personal project to him. But he's also sort of saying thank you to audiences for coming back to the cinema, because we are still in a kind of sort of post-COVID environment where people are still somewhat hesitant to go back into movie theaters. And you can tell how much it meant to him that this movie was seen in a movie theater by audience. And he talks about seeing it as a communal experience with other people, because that and his awakening and early understanding of what that means is explicitly portrayed in this film. I thought what was really interesting was the movie that had that eureka moment for him, which was the Greatest Show on Earth, which is a movie that we are going to be talking about relatively soon because it's a Best Picture winner, and it's one of the Best Picture winners that I've never seen. So that sequence that they show him watching and then recreating, which is the big sort of train wreck, I don't know how that fits in with the context of the film, and I can't wait to find out. But it was interesting that it was such a sort of an action-packed sequence. I mean, knowing Steven Spielberg's work, we can clearly see that. But it was interesting that it was that, and it was essentially a big sort of stunt scene. It was a big train crash, which is the moment that, certainly for Sammy Fabelman, that he then had to go. It scared him, it thrilled him. He then had to go home and try and recreate it in order to kind of understand it and process that exhilaration, but also equip himself with the technical know-how of how it was constructed and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like that moment for him is interpreted certainly by his mother as him processing fear,
right?
And that him using cinema as a tool to process his emotions. And as the film, I think, lays out, not least by his uncle Boris, Judd Hirsch, is there's that it's wrestling with that conflict between art and family.
And it really conveys, yeah. I mean, Steven Spielberg, from some of his earliest films, was always dealing with family on a certain issue and
absolutely
on a certain level. I mean, I think about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I think we were briefly chatting about it after the movie yesterday, about how that dysfunction of that family, as a father is obsessed with obviously in that case an alien encounter, to the point where he neglects his family. And there's something in the Fabelmans that starts to have the pennies drop in all the previous movies that we've seen, and how he's processed family and family development and inner relationships between fathers and mothers. And even the scene you just mentioned about Mitzi, the way she processed, or the way she interpreted Sam's encounter with that scene, was one of fear, which again, it's very well meaning, but off the mark. That is not what he was feeling. And what was happening at that moment was his life was being transformed irrevocably. Like, from this point on, his life will never be the same. And I think for Spielberg, he was conveying to us that there was a moment in his life when cinema invaded his soul, and it transformed his identity and who he is. And we get to then see the outworking of this transformation through the rest of the film.
Yeah, it's also his realization that finally he's found a way that he can control the narrative, I think. Because repeatedly, Sammy, particularly when he's a little bit older and a little bit more articulate, he berates his parents for moving them around constantly from Jersey to Arizona to California, disrupting the family and ultimately breaking the family apart when the parents decide it's for the best of everybody that they get divorced. And that was obviously clearly, all of those things were clearly traumatic for him growing up. And you see that in cinema, that's a way that he has found. He was like, well, I can't control my story, but I can control the narrative of story itself and these experiences for other people by creating them myself, or by seeing them through the lens of the camera. And of course, it's one of the first discoveries he makes through the lens of the camera is, unfortunately, his mother's infidelity.
What I found about this film, though, James, is some of I guess the shortcomings of it is the overall narrative was not as good as certain segments within it, certain scenes within it. I started to feel in hindsight that this was a string of vignettes in Spielberg's life that he was trying to convey. And it made me ask, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this, because it's something I was thinking about earlier today, processing the film, was, would we be interested in this movie near as much if it was just Sammy Fabelman and we knew that Sammy Fabelman wasn't a stand-in for Steven Spielberg? Because I kept thinking that even with the final scene in the film, it's a little bit anticlimactic, unless you know that this is Steven Spielberg, who's going on to make Jaws soon thereafter, and then E.T., and become one of the biggest film directors of all times. That we're able during this film to fill in some of the blanks, fill in some of the shortcomings, because we know, oh no, this is Steven Spielberg, and he's going to make E.T., he's going to make Schindler's List, he's going to be part of Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park and everything that's been part of our jukebox of life. And then I started thinking, if it was just you're making a pitch to a production company, hey, you know what? There's this story we want to do about a young Jewish kid whose family is kind of breaking down a little bit, but really discovers a love for film. It'd be like, oh, don't call us, we'll call you. But it's Steven Spielberg, and then it becomes a thing.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It was something I was thinking about as well. And I think the answer is no, we wouldn't be so interested. I mean, if it's clearly the kind of story that anybody would only tell if it's true, if it's based on their own story. Yeah. But if you're not Steven Spielberg, and you're right, if you're pitching it to the studio, they're like, who cares, quite frankly? Yeah. And I think it only resonates. But okay, it's weird. It resonates because it's backstory. to one of the biggest, arguably I would say second only to Alfred Hitchcock, the most famous film director of all time. I would say, it's film directors. Yes, they're becoming increasingly better known by the general public, but I think if you still stop the man in the street or the woman in the street, and said, name a film director, they might say, Steven Spielberg would probably be the first name anybody would say. But what's weird, I think, is that he's telling the story himself. So you've got these moments of kind of foreshadowing, if you like, throughout the movie where he's essentially telling us, this is how I got the idea for that, or here is a little sort of visual gimmick or whatever that you as a fan of my work will recognize from a movie I made 30 years later.
Right.
But the fact that he's telling you there's a kind of almost smugness to it, where he's like, see how smart I am, see how see how much of a plan all of this had, see how amazingly I evolved almost. And so, I mean, the film is very episodic. It is a lot of sort of vignettes. It's a lot of little sort of family oriented anecdotes throughout, some of which are fascinating in and of themselves, some of which help piece together a larger story. Like I think the parents, or the devolution of their relationship is actually pretty compelling and pretty interesting. But it is I think by far less than the sum of its parts. And for me, one of the weakest parts of it is the high school stuff.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't
know how you felt. It felt forced. I felt like the whole anti-Semitic encounters were like, okay, now we got to the segment of Steven Spielberg's life where he encounters anti-Semitism. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that anti-Semitism is not a real thing, and
or that he didn't encounter it that way.
Yeah. And obviously in today's current climate, it's very much a thing. It just felt kind of shoehorned into the final third of this film just out of nowhere. And granted, yes, okay, they're going from the Midwest to California, but I thought that's ironic that they're not really encountering anti-Semitism in red state America, but then they go to liberal California and suddenly there's anti-Semitism, when maybe it's a stereotype. I would have thought there would have been more of a Jewish community there than in some of the places that they'd come from. I'm not an expert in it. All I'll say is, from a viewer standpoint, it felt shoehorned and a little bit awkward.
It feels like almost a sort of a fantastical version of it. Yeah, I felt that the whole high school sequence is almost like sort of wish fulfillment fantasy for Spielberg. I think his the actor who plays him at that age, Gabriel Labelle, is more attractive than he is, more handsome than he is, it does better with girls than he does. Even the way he is bullied is arguably sort of done in a more exciting way than it probably happened at school. And obviously he comes out of it great. He kind of gets the girl, he loses the girl, but he learns something valuable from the experience, and he actually has a good time along the way. He makes this student film, which kind of wins him over with most people. There's this interesting way that he features some of the bullies in the film, which kind of plays out slightly strangely, but to a level of sort of psychological sort of manipulation that I don't think he was probably equipped to have done, the way that the film plays it out. The film plays out that he like pulls a fast one on them by showing one up to be great and to almost set them at loggerheads with one another.
That's with one another, yeah.
And you're like, I'm not convinced that you were that smart to do that. I mean, who knows? Maybe he did, and maybe he's more of a genius than we thought, and from a very early age. But that whole part of the movie felt like it was ripped from West Side Story or American Graffiti, or even the flashbacks not the flashbacks, but the 50s stuff in Back to the Future. That it was kind of sanitized and over glorified and rose tinted, which I guess this is kind of a Norman Rockwell version of Spielberg's life. It's very nostalgic. It's very the old opulent cinemas. It's the cars. It's that flashy 50s and 60s chic that's going on all around him. And
And you get this feeling for the slice of America. We're living in a time where shows that we're seeing regularly have so much representation in it. It almost became a shock to see an all-white audience. I'm sorry, an all-white cast with all-white, extras and a gym full of all-white people. And this is Norman Rockwell America. And this is the America that Steven Spielberg grew up in. And so it did lack some of the grit. Even the breakdown in the relationship with mom and dad is not like fisticuffs and fights and accusations. It's I still love, we still adore each other. We still, it's a non-traditional, even as things are collapsing, there's all this love and acceptance and mutual respect and dignity given. And so I'm not criticizing that, but the lens that I'm in hindsight that I'm seeing this through is a very middle American Norman Rockwell type. Do you know Norman Rockwell?
Yeah,
Are
sure.
you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I didn't know if I was losing you with that term.
Not at all.
But it's sterile's the wrong word. Sterile's what keeps it, but it's not sterile, but it's very one-dimensional. And that's the what we're getting, even in the conflicts between the characters.
Yeah, it jars quite considerably, considering that his last movie was West Side Story and was this incredibly inclusive and ethnically diverse reinterpretation of West Side Story, which is obviously set at a very similar time to the high school sequences here. Whereas that was all about, getting as many sort of Hispanic characters in there and Latino characters and Italians and all the rest of it, and showing off the diversity, showcasing the diversity of those neighborhoods at that time. And then in his next movie, he's like, well, this was my experience of that time. And it's completely sanitized and diluted, ethnically. I don't think it's ethnically sterile, but ethnically sanitized neighborhoods,
yes.
where
you're right.
Where everybody's a white person, everybody's a Gentile, and he was the only part, and I believe that was his experience, that he was the one Jew in the class, and I imagine that was very difficult for him. But what I will say is I actually felt that the scenes about his parents and about the struggle of their relationship felt far more genuine and authentic and honest. It felt like in the making of this film, he was trying to process what he witnessed all of those years ago, trying to understand his parents from a perspective that he didn't really have back then, in a way that I don't think he's analyzing the high school sequences in the same way. The high school sequences are far more sort of almost fetishized as a sort of fun high school romp kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas they lack an honesty and an integrity that I think the family stuff actually had.
That's a great perspective, James. I really appreciate you saying that, because that is spot on. I hadn't thought about that dichotomy between the two, but I had read where Steven Spielberg had said in his whole life he has never had therapy. He's never had a therapy session. He joked that maybe one time he did. He sees this movie as his therapy. And as you say that quote's coming back to me, because he is definitely processing his relationship with his parents through this. And you're right, I would agree. The relationship between the mom and dad is much more authentic than if it had been if he had fetishized that, it would have been much more anger and yelling and plates being thrown in the kitchen type stuff. And that doesn't happen. And what happens is something that is a little more normal when two people still love their parents and still like each other, but are realizing they're going in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes you realize that, we have been seeing him attempting to process this his entire career. He doesn't always write his screenplays. In fact, I think this is the first one that he has written himself since AI or something like that, almost 20 years ago. But he's always there and he's always on hand. So even movies like Close Encounters he did write, but even films like E.T., where he's not the credited screenwriter, it's very much his story, just being articulated through someone else's words. And you can see in all of those films, I mean, Close Encounters specifically, E.T. specifically, but going on and on and on, that they are all about broken homes, but often from the child's perspective. and it's difficult, and he struggles to get to the inherent truth of what went wrong. It's just an environment. It's a fractured environment in which quite often the child feels lonely and seeks solace somewhere else and love somewhere else because they're not getting it from the home. And this feels like he's finally, I think it should be pointed out that quite notably his parents both passed away fairly recently. Within the last sort of 5 or 10 years, I think, but they have both died. And so I think that's a release as well. I think that almost gives him the permission, the opportunity. I know that he developed the story with his sister to finally go back and finally look at this and finally examine it and process it. I wonder if he's got any of those old reels of those home movies before. I'm sure he has, because I've seen interviews with Paul Dano and Michelle Williams where they're like, oh, Steven showed us all of this stuff and all these photographs, told us all these stories. So I wonder, I'm so curious how much of those specific incidents are true, and whether he really did sort of see something on a home video that he shot. I'm sure it is.
That's what I would like to know. I mean, I know a lot of him shooting film and war films with his Boy Scout buddies. I know that that's all real, and people have talked about that before. What I have not heard is the reality of him discovering the infidelities of his mom on the reels. That sounds like a cinematic embellishment, but I don't know for sure. But you mentioned Paul Dano and Michelle Williams. I came out of the cinema last night thinking Michelle Williams has an Oscar nom with her name on it. I'm not saying she's going to win, but I think I thought her performance was fantastic. I thought Paul Dano's was fantastic as well. I thought the cast overall, to be honest, Seth Rogen, I've never been much of a Seth Rogen fan. And I thought Seth Rogen's performance in that movie last night was fabulous.
Yeah, I think it's probably some of the best work. I mean, I think I've seen in him previously that he has the ability to do serious work. I think in Steve Jobs, he was very good as Wozniak. And, I've seen him do slightly more serious stuff, and he has it in him. But yeah, it's great because he's playing like the fun character. Yeah. He's the uncle, he's the friend. He's obviously the secret lover as well, and casting Seth Rogen as that is quite ballsy in and of itself. But yeah, I think it was a really solid performance, and I quite liked Gabriel Labelle. I mean, I think he's far too handsome and cocky and confident, even when he's pretending not to be, to convince as a young Steven Spielberg, but he convinces as Sammy Fabelman. Yeah, I don't believe Steven Spielberg was that guy in school.
No,
but I believe that Sammy Fabelman was. He seems like the love child of Robert De Niro and Edward Norton. When I was watching it,
thank you for saying that, because all I kept thinking was, is this Edward Norton's love child? I'm not exaggerating when I thought that. Yeah. I didn't have the other half of the love child, but I'm thinking this is Edward Norton's kid, because it just he has the same facial features.
Yeah, no, it's kind of uncanny. I don't know. I don't think Edward Norton's got kids, but
I don't think he does either.
Certainly not of that age. But yeah, that's where I was getting. And did you recognize his sister, Jessica Butters, from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? She's the girl that DiCaprio's acting opposite in the Western TV show.
I know who that character is, but I didn't make the connection.
Who is great, and I'd seen her in something else in between. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but she is fast becoming one of the most exciting child stars out there right now. Yeah. And just I think the depth of the cast is great, and I think that it really, really helps. That so to a point where, regardless of whether you think this is wish fulfillment or this is an honest depiction of how things happen, and I don't think we should get too hung up on is this what happened in Spielberg's life or not, because he doesn't claim it to be.
No.
He claims it to be inspired by my family, but there's
even the name, the Fabelmans. This is a fable. This is. I mean, that's a play on words. That is meant to convey that this is inspired on Steven Spielberg. But again, we're filling in the blanks. I was with Steven Spielberg, because
Mm.
even when we get to the end, I kept thinking, okay, how are they going to land this plane? Because we're about 2.5 hours into this, and I'm thinking, how do you land it? Is it where he gets his ABC movie of the week? He's going to be able to direct Duel. Like how is, and this is going to launch his famous going forward. And as we come to learn, he gets 5 minutes with the greatest director of that time that's known, and it's John Ford. And what I loved about that ending, James, is that, yes, John Ford, when you mentioned Alfred Hitchcock, probably the other name that would be named among directors of the 50s, 60s in that time period would have been John Ford. And what made that special is we know Sam Fabelman, aka Steven Spielberg, will go on to become a bigger name than John Ford. So even though this cowering kid is like, oh my God, John Ford, and John Ford's going, look at that picture. No, look at that one. I fucking, beautifully played by David Lynch, who you identified immediately. As soon as he spoke, we both went, yeah, David Lynch.
Well, it was when he came in, as soon as you realized you were going to see John Ford, because he has to wait for him, he's out and he's not coming.
Yeah.
I was like, I wonder who's going to play him. It's going to have to be a name. It's got to be,
Right.
Steven Spielberg. He's not going to just get some jobbing character actor who might look a little bit like it. And he walks in, you don't quite see him, and you don't quite see it. So I was really looking to see who is it. And fortunately, before he spoke, I was like, I think I leaned over to you, didn't I? Go, that's David Lynch.
And I've been looking because he had kind of an eye patch, and I'm going, is it? And then as soon as he spoke, he had that very distinct David Lynch cadence, which is speech. But I was going to say is the very fact that we know this is Spielberg and not just Sammy Fabelman. Because if it had been just Sammy Fabelman, it'd be like, okay, that's the end of the movie. That's it. But because we can fill in the blank, we know where this story ends because it's really Steven Spielberg. And we know that even though he's the cowering little kid to John Ford, we know that his legacy will far exceed John Ford's as far as in cinematic history. I mean, Steven Spielberg arguably will go down as
sort of the greatest of all time kind of thing. Certainly the most famous of all time. Yeah.
He is the GOAT, he is the greatest of all time. And I mean, Tammy and I were saying, even before I went to go see the film, she wanted to join me, how much of our lives have been shaped, entertained, encouraged. How many times have we gotten goosebumps on our flesh, and we've gotten a spring in our step and a twinkle in our eye because Steven Spielberg gave it to us. And I'll be forever indebted.
Without a doubt,
he's the master, and he has given me so much joy and wonder in my life. And so watching this film, albeit with some of the criticisms we had, some of the wonder in it, I don't think we've talked enough about the wonder. At the beginning, when the younger version of Sammy Fabelman is made his first film with the train set, and I just got to say, the nostalgia in this film really got to me, because I'm a little bit younger, but I'm still a pre-digital, pre-internet boy. And that train set is almost the exact same train set I had growing up. Those train cars are what I had. That little transformer box made it go forward was that. We used to make little crashes with it. I was getting... And, my dad passed away a year ago. So even watching this movie, I remember Dad helping me set up the train, and we put it around the Christmas tree every year. So I say all that to say that I identify with the nostalgia that Spielberg is trying to convey in this movie. This is a moment in time that is lost. And through the magic of film, we can at least get a shadow of it and enjoy it for a brief couple hours.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that so many filmmakers working today are looking to bottle and recapture the sense of nostalgia that his movies in the 70s and 80s brought to them. I mean, the number of movies you see recently, sci-fi movies that are evoking the aesthetic and the tone of Close Encounters and E.T., or the action and the practical stunt-based action of Jaws or Raiders of the Lost Ark or something like that. It's defining the generation of filmmakers that are that are making the biggest. I mean, look at J.J. Abrams. You don't need to look any further than J.J. Abrams. Arguably one, he's making some of the biggest movies around right now, and he's wholly 100%, walking in the footsteps of Steven Spielberg, and wears it proudly on his sleeve. It does bring me to one thing, because what the film at the end does. You have that scene with John Ford. They have this conversation about framing, essentially, and where's the horizon. At the top of the frame is interesting, at the bottom of the frame is interesting, in the middle it's boring, and then you get that kind of visual gag where, as he walks off down the lot of the studio, the camera quite awkwardly and clumsily, sort of to correct itself, just goes and ducks down so that the so that the horizon is far lower in the frame. And what it does is, what that prompts in me is, it prompts in me the clash I have and the contradiction I have with the cinematography in the movie, because it ends on this brilliant sort of visual joke. The cinematographer essentially makes the joke that ends the movie. He moves the camera very deliberately to correct their framing in order to make it interesting, quote unquote interesting. Which, if you think about it, is suggesting that up until this point they're admitting that their movie has been boring, or that they're just taking the lesson, and running with it. But my issue with the cinematography in the movie is it's too interesing. Is Janusz Kaminski, who is Spielberg's go-to DP, shoots all of his movies, but that means that he shot without double checking, but you're pretty sure, like Jurassic Park and War of the Worlds and Munich and all of these Bridge of Spies and all these super rich, visually dense, super stylistic movies where there are his great thing is that there are unidentified light sources everywhere, out of the frame, through windows, all the rest of it, creating incredible light and shadow and lens flare in particular. Whereas the subject matter quite often I don't think fully justifies this kind of rich, dynamic, emotional visual palette that Kaminski brings to the movie. There are sequences where they're just sitting at home and they're watching the raindrops go down the window pane, and it looks like a shot out of The Lost World or War of the Worlds or something like that, and you're like, this is far too expressive and moody a piece of cinematography for the story. But not that it's bad, it's beautiful and it's so visually rich, but it's working on a level that the storyline
doesn't warrant. It doesn't warrant that.
A far sort of softer palette, almost sort of older film stock, perhaps, sort of different softer lenses, something like that. Do you know what I mean? Something to evoke the period a little more
period.
I mean, the movie I kept being reminded of while I was watching it was Licorice Pizza, Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza, which is set later, but it's a similar kind of nostalgic adolescent slice of life kind of story, and that I think was shot in the style of the period, whereas this very specifically, very deliberately wasn't, and I felt that kind of was at odds with the tone of the movie, I think.
No, that's interesting because, when Tarantino did Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he similarly really created a lot of the style. You felt like you were in that world at that time period using the technology. I mean, obviously not totally, but he was trying to convey a certain palette, as you'd say. And you're right, Spielberg kind of eschewed that for this. We got a traditional Spielberg cinematography.
Yeah, which is weird, because when you look at a film like sort of Munich, for example, that's the one that springs to mind. I'm sure there are better examples. That feels like it was trying to far more authentically emulate the visual aesthetic 70s, of the period.
That's interesting. I don't know why they made that choice, but what do you think about John Williams' score? It's interesting. John Williams said after this one and the next Indiana Jones, he may call it quits. This may be his swan song.
Oh, interesting. That's funny.
It's funny.
Because
It's funny. He said that then he's going to go into retirement. I think the guy's like 90 years old. I'm thinking retirement.
Why bother? Yeah,
yeah. It's that train's passed.
Die at the piano, or at the podium. It's funny you asked me what did I think of the music, and we watched this last night. I can't remember any of the music.
I was going to say the same thing. That's why I wanted to hear what you said.
Yeah,
I don't remember any identifiable music, which
right.
maybe in this kind of film is a bonus. For the score kind of is the anti what you were saying about the cinematography, rather than having a kind of a triumphant type, identifiable, iconic. It's almost just submerged into the background, and I don't know anything negative about it. It probably was meant to be just background score and not something that was readily identifiable. It sounds like possibly a stylistic choice.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The only music I can recall are the kind of jukebox songs he used in the Ditch Day film that he shot for the high school. None of the score has stuck with me at all. Which I guess on the one hand means it didn't jar, it didn't seem out of place at the time. It was very sort of it worked diegetically, so within the world of the movie, and it added to the emotional thing, but not in any kind of exhilarating way, I guess.
No, it didn't give you the goosebumps. It was not Superman,
No. But at the same time, it didn't. I don't remember it jarring at any time or feeling inappropriate at any time. And I think I would have noticed had that been the case. So all I can say is it must have been fine for me to have no memory of it whatsoever.
Well, that was nice for you to assert that John Williams' score was fine.
It was probably fine.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll sleep well tonight.
He can retire happy.
That's right. James Marsh said I did fine.
He's like, finally, the validation I've been craving.
So, James, what are we going to use to score the Fabelmans? Obviously, we need an instrument. We always like to score out of a score of 1 to 5. What unique instrument are we going to use in this film?
I guess it should be some kind of editing machine. What's the editing console that he uses?
I forgot the name of it, and I mentioned that I wanted to talk about the editing. I totally forgot. I just thought for someone who does a little bit of editing, we do editing, the idea of chopping physical film and putting it on the table, identifying it, just sounds maddening. There must have been the patience needed to do editing before digital media. There was a point in the movie where I just, as a amateur filmmaker myself, I just thought, wow, that is old school. And you have to have a real passion for that level of, because the workload's going to be considerably more.
Oh, you've got to be so patient, so organized to a level that you just don't have to be now. But you also, it shows you how painstaking, how time-consuming, how expensive the whole process was.
Oh,
because you have all that physical film everywhere. But it's obviously it's portrayed in a very sort of loving, almost kind of fetishized kind of way. It's like there's an authenticity to it, there's an integrity to it that is gone today. Has been forgotten and lost forever. So I can certainly appreciate that, and there's an accuracy to all of that. That you know that those moments mean as much personally, probably to Steven Spielberg as any of the stuff with his mum. Any of the stuff with understanding his mother's mental anguish. It resonates with equal emotional sincerity as sellotaping those little clips of these little cuttings of film to the side of his table as he works into the night.
It's so physical and so tactile, using the chemicals, and it's just fascinating. But we digress. How many Steven Spielberg intro level editing machines from the 1950s, 60s would you score the Fabelmans?
Okay, well, I mean, the stuff in it that's good is really good. And when he's, I think, not trying to eulogize himself so much or rewrite his own adolescent experiences too much, I was really into it. However, whenever his character is kind of front and center and is, learning about girls or about boys or how to stand up for himself, I was far less interested. Yeah. And it wasn't a slight on Gabriel Labelle's performance or anything like that. It was just, I don't want to hear about Steven Spielberg, telling us how he stuck up for, how he stood up to the bullies in a way that I don't believe he ever did, or got the girl in a way I don't believe he ever did. However, I thought the stuff with his parents is brilliant, and the stuff about his discovery and understanding of filmmaking is really well done, as one would hope and imagine from someone who is obviously so skilled at using those tools. So his own creative awakening, I think, is far better expressed than any of the more personal stuff in terms of his own adolescence and coming of age. So, and I think those things do kind of get in the way, unfortunately, for me. So I think it is sort of less than the sum of its parts. When it's good, it's great, but it's not always good. And so therefore is far from great. So I'm going to give it a solid but uneven 3 editing machines out of 5.
I echo so many of those sentiments. But there's a measure of wonder in this. There's a measure of, anybody who loves film is going to love aspects of this movie. But like you said, too often it moves off of those magical moments where he's seeing film on his hand for the first time, or when he's with his Boy Scout friends and they're learning some kind of special effect that they can make a bullet. We don't have money to do bullets, but we're creative and we love film and we love this. And this is a passion project. I love how Spielberg is able to get his whole troupe impassioned for his projects. You can see that there's something that boils up within him that is
contagious.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Thank you. There's something welling up in him that is passionate, it's magical, and it's contagious. Other people want to be part of what this dream is that he has, this vision he has in his head. And it's something that we've all been part of watching his legacy of film for the last 50 years. Like you said, though, occasionally when it steers away from that, or some of the dynamics of the family, that's quite interesting, it gets lost in the weeds a little bit. And it is a long film. Again, this is a little bit bloated, a little bit self-indulgent at times. So in the end, I'm going to, again, because I can give a half, I'm going to give a little bit more. I'm going to give it 3.5 editing machines, intro level editing machines, out of 5. Well, that's James and I's thought on the Fabelmans. What is your thoughts? What is your perspectives? We'd love to hear your comments in the description box below. Feel free to open up a conversation on some aspect of the film that touched you, or was there a nostalgia element? Is there something about Spielberg in general you'd like to share with us? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And James and I can also be found on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram, and you can find those links in the description box below. James?
That's right. Yeah, we'd love to hear about your favorite Steven Spielberg moments or movies. Which of his films really resonated with you, particularly at a young age, first time you saw them, that kind of thing. Which other films gave you that kind of sort of in the theater eureka moment, when you first one assumes that if you're watching this video, then you're into films in a kind of serious, passionate way, in the way that we are. So which were the movies that gave you that feeling for the first time? Did you have that kind of moment, particularly if it was in a theater? Do let us know in the comments.
Until next episode.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful to see. You ought to be in pictures. Oh, what a hit you would be.